The pre-dawn darkness pressed down on Eliza Talbot like a physical weight when she stepped out of her farmhouse door and found that someone had already been there. The soil of her north field, the field she had been dreading all week, the one that needed turning before the first planting window closed and rendered her entire season a ruin, that soil had already been broken open. Neat furrows stretched from the fence post at the road all the way to the cottonwood at the far end. Row after perfect row sliced into the earth with a precision she herself had never managed. The smell of fresh-turned dirt was everywhere, rich and alive in the cold April air of 1878, and Eliza stood in the yard holding her hand plow and feeling something break loose inside her chest that she could not immediately name. She had not asked for this. She had not asked anyone for anything in 4 years, not since Thomas had died of fever and left her with 200 acres of Cimarron Territory hardpan and debts that bent the spine just thinking about them. She had not asked for charity, had not accepted the pity casseroles the women of Redrock brought to her door in the first season, had not taken the offers from rancher Del Hooper to buy her out at a price that would have left her with enough for coach fare to Kansas City and nothing more. She had survived by being the kind of woman who picked up every tool herself, who woke before the rooster, who kept her secrets buried as deep as the roots she pulled from this unforgiving land. And now someone had plowed her field. She walked to the edge of the turned earth and crouched, pressing her fingers into a furrow. The soil was still slightly warm where the iron had worked it, which meant whoever had done this had left less than an hour ago, possibly less than 30 minutes. There was no note, no calling card, no self-congratulating announcement of the deed, just the work itself, done clean and done right, and the 2 sets of boot tracks at the field's edge that told her whoever this was, he had also brought a draft horse of some size, because no person alive could have turned this ground with a hand tool before dawn. Eliza straightened, and the feeling she had not been able to name a moment ago clarified itself into something sharp and uncomfortable. It felt like betrayal. Not a betrayal committed against her, but a betrayal of everything she had built herself into since Thomas's death. Because standing here looking at this gift she had not requested felt like evidence that she had failed to hide how desperate she was. Someone had seen through the armor she wore every single day of her life, and that was more frightening than the debt, more frightening than the drought the previous summer had threatened, more frightening than anything Del Hooper had ever said to her with his flat, commercial eyes. Someone had seen her. She turned and scanned the ridge to the northwest, where the Sawyer ranch sat beyond 2 hills and a creek that dried up every August. The ridge was dark, the sky above it just beginning to leak the faintest gray suggestion of morning. But she looked at that ridge for a long time before she went back inside to make coffee, because she already knew, in the way a person knows a thing they are not entirely ready to accept, exactly whose boots had made those tracks. 3 months earlier, Redrock, Cimarron Territory had been the kind of town that kept its nose in everyone else's business as a matter of civic duty. It was February of 1878, cold enough that the mud in the main street had frozen solid into tire ruts and boot prints, and the general store run by Harold Fitch was the informal courthouse where all judgments of local character were handed down. Eliza had come into town on the 2nd Tuesday of the month, the way she always did, with her list of supplies and her carefully counted coins. She wore her good coat, the one Thomas had bought her the year before he got sick, and she wore it with a straight back and a face that gave away absolutely nothing. This was the dark past she carried, not dramatic in the way dime novels described things, but grinding and constant and deeply hers. The loss of a husband, the assumption by everyone around her that she would eventually break, and her own iron refusal to prove them right. She was at the counter discussing the price of seed with Harold Fitch, who was explaining with his customary apologetic grimace that prices had gone up again since January, when the door opened behind her and brought in a gust of cold air and Isaac Sawyer. She had seen Isaac Sawyer before, the way you see people in a town of fewer than 300 souls, at the feed auction, at Sunday service when she attended, at the edge of other people's conversations. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from actual work rather than vanity, with dark hair that had been barbered at some point in the last several weeks and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors. He ran the Sawyer ranch 2 hills northwest of her property, which had been his father's ranch before it became his, and which was by general Redrock consensus one of the better-managed operations in the territory. He was not a man who talked much in public. She had noticed that, in the way she noticed everything that might be relevant to her own situation. A quiet man in a loud town was either trustworthy or hiding something, and she had not yet determined which applied to Isaac Sawyer. He nodded at Harold Fitch, glanced at Eliza with dark eyes that registered her presence without making a production of it, and moved to examine a display of axe handles on the side wall. He did not push into the conversation. He did not offer an opinion on seed prices. He simply stood there being present in the unobtrusive way that some large men manage. And Eliza turned back to Harold and continued the negotiation that was costing her more than she could comfortably afford. She settled on less seed than she wanted, paid her coins, accepted the wrapped parcel with a nod of thanks, and was halfway to the door when Harold said, casually and without apparent guile, "You hear about the Talbot North Field? Soil's so compacted after last summer's drought, word is it won't plant properly unless it gets a full turning before April." She stopped walking. She did not turn around. "Word is, Mrs. Talbot's been looking at renting a team from Del Hooper," Harold continued, apparently addressing Isaac now, probably because Isaac was the only other person in the store. "And you know what Hooper charges for team rental?" "Harold," Eliza said, with a voice she kept very controlled, "I am standing right here." There was a brief silence. "My apologies, Mrs. Talbot," Harold said, and he sounded genuinely flustered. She turned then and looked at Isaac Sawyer because she had the specific feeling of being looked at, and it was coming from him. He was not staring. He was looking at her the way a careful person looks at something they are trying to understand, with a seriousness that was different from curiosity and different from pity. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, which was enough to communicate that she was not a subject for discussion, and then she pushed through the door into the February cold. She did not think about Isaac Sawyer for the rest of that day. She thought about him the following morning and the one after that, and she told herself each time that this was merely the irritation of having her private business aired in public, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the way he had looked at her. February became March. The freeze broke and the mud returned. Eliza worked her land the way she always had, alone and methodical, rising before light and sleeping after dark. She repaired a section of fence on the east pasture, delivered the 3 calves that her small herd produced that season without incident, and began to look at the north field with growing dread as the calendar moved toward the planting window. The north field was the problem she could not solve simply by working harder. It needed turning with a heavy plow and a strong draft animal, and her own horse, a good and patient mare named Scout, was built for riding and light hauling rather than field work. She could rent a team from Del Hooper at a price that would erase what little buffer she had built up over the winter. She could ask a neighbor, but the neighbors she trusted were dealing with their own spring preparations. She could accept that this season the north field simply would not produce. That last option was the one that kept her awake at night, because without the north field she was looking at a harvest that would not cover her operating costs, and without covering her operating costs, the debt Thomas had left behind would compound another year, and she did calculations in the thin light of her oil lamp that always ended in the same dark place. This was her hidden crisis, the trap she lived inside every day. Not visible from the outside, where she presented herself as a competent and self-sufficient woman, but constant and grinding beneath the surface. She was at the creek at the edge of her property in the last week of March, checking on the water level after a late rainstorm, when Isaac Sawyer appeared on the opposite bank. He was on horseback, a large gray gelding, and he was clearly riding along the creek for his own purposes rather than seeking her out. But when he saw her, he stopped and dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who has spent his life around horses. "Mrs. Talbot," he said. "Mr. Sawyer." She waited to see what he would do with this, because in her experience men who stopped their horses at creeks were generally on their way to one of two things: a proposition she didn't want, or information she didn't need. He crouched at the edge of the opposite bank and looked at the water level, which had come up notably after the rain. Creeks running well should be enough for both properties through July if it doesn't dry out in June again. This was not what she had expected. She had expected him to say something about the North Field, because Harold Fitch's store was a distribution network for information, and everyone in a 10-mile radius now knew about her North Field problem. The fact that he was talking about creek water levels, which was a legitimate shared concern, made her recalibrate slightly. "My well held through last summer," she said, "but I watched the creek." He nodded. He was looking at the water rather than at her, which she appreciated because it made the conversation feel less like scrutiny and more like two landowners discussing a mutual resource. "My father put a secondary well in 71, he said, "west of the barn. If this one ever runs dry, there's generally water at 40 feet on this side of the ridge." She understood that this was information offered freely, without condition or implication, and she filed it away with the precise mental inventory she kept of everything useful. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He stood and looked at her then, directly and without ceremony. "I heard about your North Field," he said. There it was. She straightened her spine, which was already straight. "The entire territory has heard about my North Field. Harold Fitch is a generous distributor of information." Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "He means well." "He does," she agreed. "That doesn't make it less irritating." A pause stretched between them that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was full of something she could not categorize. Birds moved in the cottonwoods upstream. "I have a draft pair," Isaac said. "Belgian crosses. They could turn your North Field in a single morning if the soil's cooperating." She looked at him. "What would you want for that?" He looked back at her with those serious dark eyes. "Nothing." "I don't accept charity," she said, and she said it without heat but with absolute clarity, because this was one of the things she needed the world to understand about her, and she was willing to say it as many times as necessary. "I know you don't," he said. "It's not charity. It's the kind of thing neighbors do for each other out here. Last fall your fence line was the only thing that kept my cattle from wandering into the ravine when I had that gate problem. You didn't ask me what I'd give you for it." She thought about this. It was true that she had driven 3 of his cattle back from her fence line in October, which had required perhaps 40 minutes of her time. The comparison was not equivalent, and he had to know that. 40 minutes of cattle herding against a morning of draft horse plowing were not the same thing. "It's not the same," she said. "Maybe not by weight," he allowed, "but it's the same in principle." She studied him from across the creek. He was not performing generosity. He was not making a show of offering. He was standing there in his working clothes, muddy at the boots, talking about this the way he had talked about creek levels, practically and without theater, as though it were simply a logistical matter between two people who lived near each other. "I'll think about it," she said, which was the most she would give him, and she turned and walked back toward her property before he could say anything else. She thought about it for 9 days. She ran her calculations again. She walked the North Field and pressed her boot into the soil and felt how stubborn the compaction was. And she looked at the calendar and looked at the window for planting. And she thought about Isaac Sawyer standing at the opposite bank of the creek, talking about his Belgian draft horses, as though they were a neighborly resource rather than a significant favor. She decided, on the 9th day, that she would accept the help, but that she would need to be there when it happened so that she could observe, assist in whatever ways were possible, and maintain her own sense of participation in the work rather than merely receiving it. She would also need to find a way to return the value because she did not intend to carry a debt she had not chosen. She wrote him a note, which she sent via the Fitch store's informal message passing system, saying simply, "I will accept the offer of the team for the North Field. Please advise when would be convenient for you. E. Talbot." His note back, arriving the following afternoon, read, "Saturday morning. I'll come before sunrise to get started while the soil is cool. No need for you to be up early on my account. I.S." She read this note 3 times. She was not sure whether she was annoyed by it or moved by it or both simultaneously. The instruction not to be up early on his account struck her as either presumptuous or thoughtful, and she could not decide which. She decided she would get up before sunrise regardless, because this was her field and her land, and she would not sleep through the working of it. And then she woke before sunrise on that Saturday in early April of 1878, and when she stepped outside with her hand plow still in her grip, she found that he had come even earlier than she had risen, and the field was already done. She stood in her yard for a long time with the smell of turned earth all around her, and something dangerously close to tears burning behind her eyes, which she would not allow. And then she went inside and made coffee, and stood at her kitchen window watching the light grow on the ridge to the northwest. At 8 o'clock in the morning, when the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, and the day was bright and clear and cold, she heard the sound of a horse in her yard and looked out to see Isaac Sawyer on his gray gelding, apparently coming back to check that the work had been done properly. He swung down from the horse with that same unhurried ease she had noticed before, tied the gelding to her fence post, and walked to the edge of the north field to look at the work. She put on her coat and went outside. He heard her coming and turned. He looked as though he had been working since before dawn, which he had, and there was dried mud on his boots and the general roughness about him of serious physical effort. But he stood straight, and his expression when he looked at her was serious and attentive and completely without self-congratulation. "You came back," she said. "Wanted to make sure the furrows were right," he said. "Sometimes the second set of eyes catches what you miss when you're working before light." She looked at the field. "They're right," she said. "They're more than right. You know you did too much." "I did what the field needed," he said. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Mr. Sawyer, I want to be honest with you about something." He waited, attentive. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "I'm not good at accepting things I haven't arranged for myself. It makes me feel," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "exposed." His expression changed very slightly, the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves over the sun, not dramatic, but perceptible to someone paying attention. "I understand that," he said. "I'm not trying to make you feel exposed, I'm trying to be a neighbor. There's a line between those things." "There is," he agreed. "I'll try to stay on the right side of it." She looked at him for a moment, measuring. Then she said, "Come inside, I've got coffee made." Something shifted in his face very briefly that she recognized afterward as surprise. He had not expected the invitation. She had not entirely expected to issue it. But she had, and he accepted it with a nod that was as undemonstrative as everything else about him, and he followed her into the farmhouse. The kitchen was warm from the stove and clean in the particular way of someone who maintains order by necessity rather than by inclination. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him at the table and sat across from him with her own cup in both hands. "How long have you been running the Sawyer ranch alone?" she asked, because if she was going to have this man in her kitchen, she was going to have an actual conversation. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, hands that were large and were roughened, and considered the question. "For years," he said, "since my father passed. Before that I was running it with him. For years. The same amount of time she had been on her own." She did not say this aloud, but she noted it. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. "A sister in Dodge City," he said. "She's married to a dry goods merchant. We write." He paused. "You?" She shook her head. "My family is in Ohio. They've asked me to come home more than once. I've said no." "Why?" She looked at him across the table. The question was direct, and she found that she did not resent it the way she might have from someone else. There was something in the way he asked things without pressure behind it, the question itself, but not an agenda attached to it, that made honest answering feel possible. "Because this land is mine," she said. "Thomas and I built here together. When he died, the choice was to leave and go back to being someone else's daughter or someone else's responsibility, or to stay and be my own person in my own place. I chose to stay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That took courage." "It took stubbornness," she said. "I'm not sure they're the same thing." "Out here they might be," he said. And again that thing happened near his expression that was almost but not quite a smile. And Eliza Talbot, who had not been in the habit of being charmed by anyone, felt it register somewhere below her sternum. She refilled his coffee without asking and changed the subject to the practical matter of seed selection for the newly turned north field. And they talked for another 40 minutes about soil and planting schedules and the particular challenges of Cimarron Territory growing conditions. And it was the most comfortable conversation she had had with another adult human being in a very long time. When he stood to leave, he said, "If you need anything else this season, Mrs. Talbot, you don't have to arrange it through 9 days of deliberation. You can just ask." She stared at him. "How did you know it was 9 days?" "Because I sent the note on a Monday and you responded on the Wednesday of the following week," he said simply. 9 days. He had counted 2. She did not know what to do with that information, so she said nothing, and he put on his hat and went out to his horse and rode back toward the ridge to the northwest. She stood at her kitchen window for a long time after he had gone. Spring came in hard that year, which in the Cimarron Territory meant alternating between days warm enough to work in shirt sleeves and nights that still dropped below freezing. And this whipsawing of temperatures was simultaneously a blessing and a hazard for everything she had planted in the north field. The furrows Isaac had cut proved their worth in the first week after planting, draining excess moisture from the April rains rather than letting the seeds drown. And by late April, she had seedlings breaking the surface in even rows that made her practical heart do something very close to leap. She saw Isaac Sawyer twice more in April. Once at the Fitch store, where they exchanged a nod that felt different from the nods they had exchanged before, weighted with coffee and conversation and the shared work of the field. And once when she was repairing her east fence and looked up to find him on his horse at the fence line between their properties, apparently checking his own fence and apparently unconcerned that she had noticed him looking toward her work. She walked to the fence line. "The post at the northwest corner has rotted through," she said, which was useful information because his fence line connected to hers at that post. He dismounted and came to look. He crouched examining the post and then stood and looked at her. "I've got treated posts in the barn," he said. "I can bring one by." "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll be on this section of fence anyway." He came the next morning with 2 posts, one for his side, one for hers, and they worked the section of fence together in a silence that was entirely companionable, which surprised her. She had spent 4 years arranging her life so that silence was comfortable and solitude was workable, and she had not expected to find that a specific person's presence could slot into that established peace without disrupting it. But his did. He worked without narrating the work, without offering unnecessary instructions, without performing competence. He simply did the work beside her, and afterward he drank the water she brought out in a tin cup and said, "Same time next Saturday. I want to check the rest of this line." "All right," she said. They checked the fence line the following Saturday, and the one after that, and at some point during the 3rd Saturday she realized that the fence line had been thoroughly checked 2 Saturdays ago, and they were now simply walking it together because that had become a thing they did. And this realization arrived with a warmth in her chest that she inspected for quite a while before admitting to herself what it was. May came. The north field was a clear success, the seedlings growing strong and regular in their furrows. She had avoided the worst outcome. the one that the dark calculations in the lamplight had threatened, and her season was looking, if not prosperous, at least survivable. She allowed herself, on a warm evening in the second week of May, to sit on her porch in the last of the daylight and not think about anything pressing, which was a luxury she rarely permitted. It was in this rare, relaxed state that Isaac Sawyer rode into her yard on the gray gelding, which she now knew was named Porter, and swung down with the easy motion she had catalogued without intending to, and came to the foot of the porch steps. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. She gestured at the second chair on the porch, which she had not put there for any particular purpose but which had been there since before Thomas died. He sat in it with a brief moment of something almost like self-consciousness that she found unexpectedly endearing, and he turned his hat in his hands and then apparently decided against fidgeting and set the hat on his knee instead. "There's a dance at the Granger Hall on the 20th, he said, "for the spring planting celebration." She knew about the dance. She had not planned to attend because she rarely attended social events, because she found them emotionally complicated in the way that being a young widow in a small town was always emotionally complicated, people watching her to see whether she was moving on, people watching her to see whether she was to marry, the general surveillance of community opinion. "I know about it," she said carefully. He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes. "I would like to take you," he said, "if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. The evening air smelled of blossoming things, which was not usually a detail she registered but which she registered now. "Why?" she asked, which was the most honest question. He thought about this. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than reaching for a quick, smooth answer. "Because I've been looking forward to talking to you every time I know I'll see you," he said. "And because a dance is a reason to spend more time with you than fence line inspection allows." She felt the warmth in her chest migrate upward and become something dangerous in her throat. She had not expected honesty this direct. She had been braced for flattery or performance, for the kind of courtship language that was all surface and no foundation, and this was neither of those things. This was a man stating a fact about his own internal experience with the same practicality with which he had discussed creek levels and draft horses. "I haven't danced in 4 years, she said, which was not a yes or a no but was something true. "I haven't either," he said. "We'll probably be terrible at it." She laughed. It came out of her before she could decide whether to allow it, and it was a real laugh, not the careful social smile she deployed in public. It surprised her. She thought it surprised him too from the way his expression changed. "All right," she said, "the 20th. He left shortly after, and she sat on the porch in the gathering dark and examined what had just happened with the same rigorous attention she gave to every significant event. And what she found, when she looked honestly, was that she was afraid. Not of Isaac Sawyer specifically, but of what it meant to want someone's company again. Of what it meant to have started looking forward to things. She had built her life after Thomas on the premise that the only person she could rely on without risk was herself, and that premise had served her. It had been the armor against the hidden motive she suspected in everyone who offered help, the shield against the trap of dependence. Wanting Isaac Sawyer's company felt like a crack in that armor, and she lay awake in her dark house that night examining the crack for a long time before she could sleep. Del Hooper came to her farm on a Friday morning 10 days before the dance. He was a large man in his mid-40s, with the kind of prosperous solidity that in the West translated to power, and he had been making offers to buy her out since the month after Thomas's death. He had over the years evolved from politely transactional to something with a sharper edge, and she met him in the yard the way she always did outside, standing, offering no invitation in, because she did not trust Del Hooper in her house. "Mrs. Talbot," he said, tipping his hat with the mechanical courtesy of a man who had never felt courtesy as a genuine impulse. "Mr. Hooper, I'm making a new offer," he said, "better than the last. I want the North Field in particular. That soil, given proper cultivation, would grow considerable. I'm prepared to offer $300 over my last price." She looked at him. The last price had been insultingly low, $300 over insultingly low was still low, and she knew it. "I'm not interested," she said, the way she had said it every time before. Something in his expression shifted, and she recognized this shift from previous conversations. It was the point at which the courteous mask thinned to reveal something more calculated beneath. "Word is you're spending a lot of time with Sawyer," he said. She kept her face entirely still. "That's not your business." "It might be mine if it becomes the neighborhood's," he said. "A woman in your situation, widowed, alone, reputation is currency out here, Mrs. Talbot. You know that." She understood what he was doing. It was the oldest kind of trap, the threat of social censure wielded to create pressure, to make her feel that her independence was contingent on other people's approval. It was the kind of dark manipulation that she had always known existed in men like Del Hooper, and it had always come eventually. She had been waiting for it. "Mr. Hooper," she said, "I have a reputation in this community as a hard-working, honest landowner who has maintained her property and met her obligations every year since my husband's death. That reputation rests on my behavior, not on your interpretation of it. I suggest you take your offer and your implications and remove both from my property." His face darkened. "You'll reconsider," he said. "They all do eventually." "Good day," she said, and did not move until he had remounted his horse and ridden down the road, and then she let out a long, slow breath and went back to work, because work was the thing she trusted absolutely. She thought about telling Isaac what had happened. She turned this over for 2 days before deciding not to, because the situation with Del Hooper was hers to manage and not a crisis to be shared, and because she was not yet sure what it meant that telling Isaac felt like a natural impulse. She had not told anyone things for 4 years. The impulse to tell Isaac Sawyer felt like another crack in the armor she was supposed to maintain. The evening of the Granger Hall dance arrived with a sky full of stars and air that had finally lost its winter teeth entirely. She wore her good dress, the deep blue one she had not put on since Thomas's funeral, which was a choice she made deliberately, and which required her to stand at her small mirror for several minutes, convincing herself that wearing it was not a betrayal of anything but was simply wearing a dress. Isaac arrived at her door precisely when he had said he would, driving a small wagon because the evening was cool, and a wagon offered more comfort than riding. He looked different, his good coat, his hat brushed clean, his dark hair neatly kept, and he looked at her when she came to the door with an expression that was very brief and very complete in its admiration before he reassembled his customary composure. "You look well," he said, which, given how he had looked at her in that first moment, was the most enormous understatement she had heard in years, and she found she liked him for the restraint of it. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They drove to the Granger Hall in a conversation that moved between the practical, her Northfield seedlings, his spring calf numbers, and the personal, what Isaac's father had been like, what Eliza's childhood in Ohio had held. And she was aware as they drove that this was the longest uninterrupted time they had spent together, and that it felt entirely natural, which was something she had stopped expecting from any experience. The hall was bright with lanterns and loud with the territorial fiddle player who came to redrock every spring, and the room was full of people who noticed the arrival of Eliza Talbot and Isaac Sawyer together, with the particular attention of a small community that had been watching both of them for years. She felt the attention like a pressure on the back of her neck, and managed it by keeping her chin up and her expression composed and reminding herself that she did not owe anyone her private business. Isaac seemed entirely untroubled by the attention, which she found settling. They danced, and they were in fact both somewhat terrible at it, and this shared incompetence made them laugh in the middle of the dance floor in a way that released something she had been holding for a very long time. He was solid and warm and utterly genuine, and when he held her hand for the turn of a reel she felt the calluses of his palms and the care with which he held her, firm enough to be certain and light enough to be respectful, and she thought that a person's hands told more about them than almost anything else. They danced 3 dances and then stood at the edge of the room with cups of the sweet tea the Granger Hall women provided and talked about nothing in particular, and it was one of the better evenings of her life, which was a fact she acknowledged quietly to herself without attaching too much to it. Del Hooper was at the dance. She had expected this. He was at every public event, because public events were where power was performed in a town like Reed Rock. He looked at her and Isaac with an expression that was not a readable thing, but that made her neck prickle. She did not give him the satisfaction of any visible reaction. Driving home in the cool spring night, Isaac said, "Hooper was watching you." "He watches everyone," she said. "He watches you particularly," Isaac said. "Has he said anything to you?" A pause. "He made another offer for the land," she said, which was true but not the whole of it. Isaac was quiet for a moment. Did he behave properly? She considered this. He was as proper as he ever is, which is to the surface level only. Another quiet moment. "If he makes you uncomfortable," Isaac said, "I want you to tell me." She felt the complicated feeling of this, the part of her that wanted to say, "Yes, I will," and the part that said, "I handle my own difficulties," and she negotiated between them and said, "I can handle Del Hooper." "I know you can," he said, and she heard in this not a dismissal but a genuine acknowledgement. "That doesn't mean you have to." She looked at the dark road ahead, lined with scrub and the faint silver of sage in the moonlight, and she said, "He suggested that my being seen with you might affect my reputation." Isaac's jaw tightened. She could see it in profile against the moonlit sky. "Did he?" "He did. I told him it was none of his business and asked him to leave my property." "And he left?" "He did, after making the standard implication that I would come around eventually." "He's wrong," Isaac said flatly. "I know he's wrong," she said. "I simply wanted you to know it had happened." There it was. She had told him, and the world had not ended and the armor had not shattered, and what she felt instead of exposure was something she might, if pressed, have described as relief. He looked at her then briefly, with an expression she could not fully read in the moonlight but which felt significant. "Thank you for telling me," he said. They reached her farmhouse. He walked her to the door, which no one had done in 4 years, and stood on the porch step below her so that they were at the same level, and he looked at her with great seriousness. "I want to call on you properly," he said, "if you're willing." She felt the warmth in her chest again, the dangerous one. "You've been calling on me," she said. "Fence lines and coffee and plowed fields." "That was under the cover of neighborliness," he said. "I want to be honest about what I'm doing." She looked at him for a long time in the moonlight. "Come for supper on Sunday," she said. "That's honest enough." He smiled then, a real one, and it changed his entire face in a way she had not seen before, and she looked at it the way you look at something you want to remember. "Sunday," he said. "Good night, Mrs. Talbot." "Good night, Mr. Sawyer," she said, and went inside. She cooked supper for him on Sunday. She was a practical cook, not a performative one, and she made what she made well, a roast with root vegetables, bread she had baked that morning, preserved apples from her cellar. He arrived precisely on time with a small jar of honey from his own hives, which she accepted without ceremony and put on the table. They ate and talked. The conversation by this point had a texture to it that she was beginning to recognize as specific to him. The way he was genuinely interested in whatever she said, the way he thought before he responded rather than filling space with words, the way he occasionally surprised her with something she had not expected, an observation or a piece of knowledge that came from a different angle than she was looking from. He told her about his father that evening, about how the elder Sawyer had built the ranch from a raw land claim in 1862, and had worked it with a ferocity that was both admirable and, eventually, destroying overwork, and the territory's unforgiving summers had broken his health in his early 60s. Isaac had watched his father diminish over 3 years before he died, and had taken over the ranch at 28, alone. "You were young for it," she said. "I'd been doing it alongside him for 10 years, he said. "I knew the work. What I didn't know was what it felt like to be solely responsible for it." "Did you figure it out?" "I'm still figuring it out," he said. "Some days it feels like I have a handle on it. Other days the sheer amount of it, he paused, choosing words carefully, presses down. She knew exactly what he meant. She had never heard anyone describe it this precisely before, the specific weight of soul responsibility, the days when the enormity of everything that fell on one person's shoulders became a physical sensation. "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her. "You know. Better than anyone," she said. Something deepened between them in that moment, some recognition, some understanding that was below the level of words, the particular connection that comes from two people discovering that they have been carrying the same thing in isolation and finding each other across that solitude. She felt it, and she saw him feel it, and neither of them said anything about it directly, which was perhaps the most intimate thing that had happened between them. He helped her clear the table without being asked, which Thomas had never done, and which she noticed with a slightly complicated feeling. He washed the dishes without commentary, efficiently, and she dried them and put them away, and they worked in the kitchen together in a silence that had moved beyond comfortable into something she might have called precious if she were the kind of person who used that word. At the door when he left, he looked at her with that seriousness she had come to expect from him, and he said, "Eliza." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure. "Isaac," she said back, giving him the same. He smiled again, the real one, and left. June arrived with heat and growth, and the long, clear days of a good summer beginning to establish itself. The North Field was producing magnificently, the most productive she had ever seen it, and she walked the rows in the mornings with a satisfaction that she allowed herself to feel without qualification. This was what she had worked for, what she had refused to give up, and seeing it realized was a private triumph that belonged entirely to her, and that she shared with no one except that she found herself wanting to tell Isaac about it. And she did tell Isaac about it. On one of the evenings he came to her porch and they sat in the two chairs watching the light change. Del Hooper made himself felt again in June, though not directly to her. She heard, through the reliable network of Redrock gossip that moved through the Fitch store, that Hooper had been talking. Specifically, he had been talking about Eliza Talbot and Isaac Sawyer in terms designed to suggest that their relationship was somehow illicit, that a widow woman spending evenings with a neighboring rancher was a thing worth raising eyebrows about. The implication was the same one he had made to her face in May, but now it was being distributed more widely. She heard this on a Wednesday afternoon and stood in the Fitch store holding her parcel of supplies and feeling a very cold anger settle in her chest. Harold Fitch was telling her this with an apologist's pink face, clearly uncomfortable, clearly trying to give her information he thought she needed. "He's been saying it to several people," Harold said. "I thought you should know." "Thank you, Harold," she said, very calmly. "I appreciate you telling me." She went home and sat at her kitchen table and thought about this with precision. What Del Hooper was doing was using the social currency of reputation to create pressure, to make her feel that her relationship with Isaac was a liability, that community acceptance was being threatened, that she should therefore feel exposed and vulnerable and perhaps more susceptible to his offer on the land. It was a dark calculation and a coward's tactic, and it made her furious. She wrote a note to Isaac that evening. "I need to tell you something. Can you come tomorrow morning?" He came the next morning before 8. She made coffee and told him everything, what Hooper had been saying and to whom, as far as Harold knew, and what she believed Hooper's purpose was. Isaac listened without interrupting. His expression was controlled, but she had learned to read the small indications beneath the surface, and what she saw there was a controlled and serious anger. "He's trying to use me against you," she said, "by making our association a source of embarrassment." "He's miscalculated," Isaac said. "How?" He looked at her steadily. "Because his tactic only works if you feel that what we have is something to be ashamed of. And you don't, do you?" She thought about it. She didn't. What she felt about Isaac Sawyer, the growing, terrifying, wonderful thing that she had been tending carefully over months as though it were a seedling that required particular care, was the opposite of shameful. It was the best and most real thing in her life at this moment. "No," she said, "I don't." Then his tactic fails, Isaac said simply. But he can still damage your reputation, she said. And mine. Even if we know the truth of it, Eliza, he said. And then he paused, and she could see him deciding something, crossing some internal threshold. Would you be willing to make it impossible for him to imply anything? She looked at him. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. I know it's early. I know it might seem fast or presumptuous or tied to the wrong reasons if I'm asking now with Hooper in the background. I want to be clear that the Hooper situation is not the reason. It's just clarifying the timing. I would have gotten here regardless. She sat very still. The morning light was coming through her kitchen window in the particular slant of June, long and golden, and the smell of coffee was in the air. And Isaac Sawyer was sitting across her kitchen table asking her to marry him with the same directness with which he talked about creek levels and fence posts and Belgian draft horses. You're right that it seems fast, she said. It's been 4 months, he said. For people who see each other every week and have talked about more real things than most people talk about in a year, I don't know that 4 months is fast. She thought about this. I would need us to be honest about the land arrangements, she said, because this was the thing that mattered most practically. My land stays mine. I'm not giving up my land. I wouldn't ask you to, he said immediately. Your land is yours. I have my land. They're adjacent, which is convenient, but they're separate. However you want to handle the legal arrangement, I'll support it. She looked at her hands on the table. The hands that had been doing this work alone for 4 years. The hands that had held a hand plow at sunrise a few months ago and found a field already done for her. The hands that had accepted Isaac Sawyer's calloused palm for a reel at the Granger Hall and recognized the care in his grip. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. I'll marry you. His expression did the thing she had learned to love. The controlled surface and the real emotion visible beneath it like light through fabric. And he reached across the table and took her hands in his, both of them, and held them with exactly that care she had recognized from the dance floor. They went together to the county seat at Barclay in the second week of July, 1878, with Harold Fitch's wife and old Doc Pearson from Redrock as witnesses, and were married in a civil ceremony by the county judge in a room that smelled of paper and wood polish. Eliza wore her blue dress. Isaac wore his good coat. The ceremony was short and entirely official, and afterward they had dinner at the hotel dining room, just the 4 of them, and Harold's wife cried, and Doc Pearson raised a glass of water to them with great solemnity, and Eliza sat across the table from Isaac Sawyer, her husband, and felt something complete and solid settle in her chest like a foundation stone. Del Hooper heard about the marriage within 48 hours of their return to Redrock, because Del Hooper always heard about everything within 48 hours. He came to the property, her property, which remained legally hers as agreed, one morning a week after the wedding, and she met him in the yard. I heard about the marriage, he said. I imagine you did, she said. My offer stands, he said, on the land. I know it does, she said, and my answer stands, no. He looked at her with those flat commercial eyes, and then looked at the north field, which was standing in the full green abundance of a mid-July that was more than justifying every decision she had made about it. That field produced well, he said, which was acknowledgment and threat and defeat all at once. It did, she said. Good day, Mr. Hooper. He left, and she watched him go and felt the chapter close with a quiet and permanent click. The summer was good. Not just adequate good, not just survivable good, but genuinely and expansively good in the way that seasons occasionally are, when everything aligns, weather and soil and effort, and timing all arriving at the same point. The north field produced a harvest that, when she sat down to calculate it in September, allowed her to make the most substantial payment she had ever made on the remaining debt. Not eliminating it entirely, but reducing it to something she could see the end of, which was an entirely different thing from the bottomless anxiety she had lived with for 4 years. Isaac's ranch had a good summer, too. His cattle numbers were up, his hay production sufficient, and the Belgian crosses, the same pair that had turned her north field in the dark before dawn, had done the work of 4 horses in the summer's tasks. He had a kind of satisfaction about him that settled on the Sawyer ranch and extended to their new shared life that they were still navigating, carefully and with mutual respect. She did not move into the Sawyer ranch house. This had been a conversation they had early, a practical and honest one. Her house was on her land and his house was on his land, and the mile between them was manageable, and neither of them felt that the other needed to give up their established home. She spent 3 nights a week at his ranch and he spent 2 at hers, and the other 2 nights they were each in their own spaces, which had seemed to outside observers like an unusual arrangement, but which felt to them like the honest acknowledgement of 2 people who had each learned to live alone and needed to retain some of that. "People will talk about the arrangement," she had said, when they had established it. "People will talk regardless," he had said. "Let them talk. We know what we are." What they were, she discovered over the following months, was a kind of partnership she had not known it was possible to have. Not the merger of 2 people into one undifferentiated unit, but 2 whole and separate people who chose each other repeatedly, every day, with full knowledge and full intention. He helped her without making her feel helped. This was an art she had not seen before in another person, and that she admired more than she could easily say the way he contributed to her work without overriding her authority in it. The way he would notice something that needed doing and ask if she wanted assistance rather than simply doing it. The way he learned the boundaries of her independence and respected them even when he probably could have done a thing faster or more easily alone. She did the same for him in the ways she could, and the mutual respect of it built something between them that felt architecturally sound, like a structure with both a solid foundation and proper weight-bearing walls. He knew things about her that no one else knew, and she knew things about him. She knew that he had been afraid after his father's death, not of the work, but of the silence of the house, the peculiar quality of grief that lives in domestic spaces. She knew that he had a habit of walking the perimeter of his land at evening, not for inspection but for the feeling of knowing what was his. She knew that he had once, in his early days of running the ranch alone, made a bad business decision that had cost him considerably, and that he carried this as a private failure, even though he had fully recovered from it financially. He knew that she sometimes woke at 3 in the morning from a dream she never clearly remembered, but that always left her cold, and that the best response to this was to make tea and sit with her, until it passed without talking about what the dream might mean. He knew that she read every book she could get her hands on, and that the Fitch store's small selection of available titles was a source of constant frustrated longing. He knew that she had loved Thomas Talbot genuinely and grieved him genuinely, and had also, in the private honesty she allowed herself with Isaac, been lonely in her marriage in ways that she had not fully understood until she experienced its alternative. This was perhaps the deepest intimacy between them, the places where honesty about the past was allowed without judgment. October arrived, and with it the harvest. She brought in the north field herself, with Isaac beside her on the second day when his own harvest was complete, and the 2 of them worked the rows in the golden October light until the wagon was full, and the field was bare, and the particular satisfaction of a completed season lay over everything like a quiet benediction. She stood at the field's edge in the last of the afternoon sun, looking at the bare-turned earth, and felt the tears she had refused on the morning she had found the field already plowed come with more willingness now, and she did not stop them this time. Isaac stood beside her. He did not ask why she was crying. He put his arm around her, which he was good at, the particular kind of close and warm that was not crowding, and she leaned into him a small amount and let the feeling run its course. 4 years, she said eventually, and now the 5th is looking better, he said. Because of you, she said. Because of you, he said. I just plowed a field. She looked up at him. Before sunrise, she said. The soil is better when it's cool, he said with a straight face. She laughed, and he did too, and there in the October light of the bare north field with the smell of harvest all around them, she felt the last of the armor she had worn for 4 years become something she no longer needed, in the same way, not discarded, because some of it was good and useful and would always be part of her, but transformed. Not a shield against the world, but a foundation under her own feet. Winter that year was their first full winter together, and it was the kind of winter the Cimarron Territory occasionally delivered, sustained cold with heavy snowfall in December that kept people close to home and fires burning around the clock. She was at her own farmhouse for most of December, with Isaac coming over twice a week when the road was passable, and these visits during the long cold darkness became some of the richest time of her life. Evenings with the lamp lit and the stove burning, books read aloud or read separately in comfortable parallel, conversations that ranged wide and returned always to the ease of two people who had genuinely found each other. In January she realized she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before telling anyone, holding it in the privacy of her own understanding, examining it from every angle. She was 31 years old. She had not, in her years with Thomas, conceived, which had been a grief she had learned to carry quietly. Now, at 31, with her second husband and her north field producing and her debt finally in visible retreat, now this. She told Isaac on a Sunday morning in late January when he had come to her farmhouse in the cold, and she had made coffee, and they were at the kitchen table, the same table where he had asked her to marry him, the same winter light in the window. "I'm pregnant," she said. He became very still. She watched this happen, watched the stillness travel over him and settle into something deep and certain. His eyes met hers with an expression she had not seen before on his face and would never entirely forget afterward, the particular look of a person encountering something that is more than they had allowed themselves to hope for. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I waited 3 days to make sure," she said. "I'm sure." He reached across the table for her hand, the same gesture as the morning of the proposal, and held it. He said nothing for a long moment, and the silence was full of everything it needed to be. "Are you?" he began. "I'm frightened," she said honestly, "and I'm very glad." "Both things," he said. "Both things," she agreed. The pregnancy was not easy in the first months. She had the particular exhaustion of early pregnancy while simultaneously trying to manage the late winter preparations for the spring planting season, and these two things in combination required her to accept more help than she was accustomed to accepting. Isaac was good at this, at offering the help in ways that did not undermine her sense of herself. He did not tell her to rest. He asked what would be most useful and then did it. When she needed to sit, he made it easy for her to sit without making her feel like an invalid. When she needed to work, he worked beside her without comment on her pace. Doc Pearson from Redrock confirmed the pregnancy formally in February and gave his assessment, which was cautiously optimistic. She was healthy and strong, he said, the kind of woman whose physical condition was in her favor. He expected no particular complications. The spring of 1879 came with its now familiar whipsawing temperature, and the north field was plowed together this time in daylight, with both of them on the ground and Porter and his partner in harness in the second week of April. She walked the furrows when they were done and felt the rightness of it, the continuity of it. The same field. The same furrows, cut by the same draft team. A year on and everything different. She planted and tended and grew alongside the season in the literal sense, and the summer of 1879 was full in the way that things sometimes are when life accumulates rather than depletes. In August she moved to the Sawyer ranch house full-time, because the baby's arrival was approaching and the Sawyer house had more space and Isaac's proximity, and because she was ready. She kept her farmhouse maintained and kept it legally hers, and went to it regularly to check the land. But she set up her life in the Sawyer ranch house with the particular care of a person who knows what they want and how to arrange it. The baby arrived in September of 1879, which was good timing given that the harvest was complete and the season was settling. It was a boy, and Isaac, when placed with this news by Doc Pearson, and then confirmed by his own eyes. A son, small and furious and undeniably present, sat in the chair in the corner of the bedroom, and put his head in his hands for a long moment in a way she recognized as a man who is very moved and is managing it. "Come here," she said from the bed. He came and she put the boy in his arms, and she watched Isaac Sawyer hold his son for the first time with those hands she had catalogued from the beginning, the large, work-roughened, careful hands, and she felt the full weight of everything that had led to this moment settle into place like the final stone of an arch. "What will we name him?" Isaac asked. "I thought James," she said, "for your father." He looked at her with that expression that was deep and unguarded and real. "James," he said. "Yes." James Sawyer grew into his first year, with the determination of someone who understands he has arrived into a life worth inhabiting. He was healthy and demanding, and very like his father in the set of his expression, which she found continually amusing. He slept in the ranch house bedroom and spent his waking hours surrounded by the sounds and smells of a working ranch and a working farm. Because his parents did not stop working, they simply arranged the work around him. By the time James was a year old, in September of 1880, the North Field had produced its third consecutive good harvest, and the debt Thomas Talbot had left behind was cleared entirely. She received the final acknowledgment from the bank in Barclay on a Wednesday afternoon, and stood at the farmhouse kitchen table, her farmhouse, her table, and read it twice. Then she walked to the North Field and stood at its edge and looked at it for a long time. The field had been fallow this season, resting, given over to cover crop the way good agricultural practice required every few years. It was green with clover and the roots that would break down over the winter to feed the soil for the next season. It was not dramatic looking, this field in its resting state. It looked ordinary. It had produced the extraordinary, and now it was resting, and there was a kind of lesson in this she appreciated. She went back to the ranch house and found Isaac in the barn repairing a harness, James in the pen of blankets and wood that served as his daytime containment system within viewing distance of where Isaac worked. She came and sat on the hay bale beside James and watched Isaac work for a moment. "The debt is paid," she said. He stopped, turned, looked at her. "Entirely," she said. He set down the harness. He came to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her with that deep and unguarded expression she loved and kissed her forehead, which was not where he usually kissed her but which in this moment felt like the exact right thing. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. He shook his head slightly. "That was yours. I didn't have that debt." "No," she said, "but you made it possible to pay it." He held her face in his hands and looked at her, and then he said, "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known." She had been called competent and stubborn and determined and capable, and she had accepted these adjectives with nods that meant thank you and also I know. She had not been called extraordinary, and the word from him, simple, direct, with no theater behind it, hit her somewhere that she had not known was still tender. "I love you," she said. She had said it before over the course of their life together, but this time it came with the full weight of everything behind it, the armor she had built and then allowed to transform, the field plowed before sunrise, the coffee across the kitchen table, the years of work and love and building. "I love you," he said back the same way. James, from his pen of blankets, announced something in the vigorous and completely unintelligible language of 1-year-olds, and they both looked at him and laughed, and the moment expanded into the ordinary ongoing life that held all the other moments. By the spring of 1881, James was walking and making constant declarative statements in his developing language, most of which concerned the horses, which were his primary passion. Isaac began taking him to the barn in the mornings during feeding time, this small serious boy pointing at Porter with enormous insistence, and watching this from the barn door. Her husband and her son in the early morning light. Eliza felt a joy that was quiet and steady and daily, nothing like the dramatic and precarious feeling of early love, but in its own way more sustaining. She was pregnant again, which she had confirmed in February. This time she told Isaac the same evening rather than waiting 3 days, because she had learned over these years that sharing things did not reduce them. He received this news the same way he had received the first, the stillness, the deep expression, the hands that came to hers. When? He asked. October, Doc Pearson thinks, she said. James will be old enough to have opinions about it, Isaac said. James already has opinions about everything, she said. A new sibling will simply be one more thing he has opinions about. This made him laugh, which she collected the way she collected all his laughs, not taken for granted, because he did not give them carelessly. The October of 1881 brought a daughter, which surprised neither of them, and which delighted James in a way that was startling in a not quite 2-year-old. He stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with solemn consideration, and then announced her name, which was approximately Ma, and did not correspond to any name they had chosen. They named her Clara. Clara Sawyer arrived into a life that was established and warm and full of competent love, and she grew toward it the way plants grow toward light. The North Field, rested in 1880, came back in 1881 with a vigor that was the agricultural equivalent of a declaration. She walked it in the mornings when the season allowed, sometimes with James toddling beside her in his serious exploration of everything, and the field felt to her. She knew this was irrational. She was a practical woman. She knew a field was a field like a companion, like something that had been through things with her and was still here, still producing, still alive in the Cimarron Territory soil under a wide sky. Isaac expanded the Sawyer Ranch operation in 1882, adding a third section of pasture and increasing the cattle numbers, and she expanded the Talbot farm operation by establishing a kitchen garden that produced vegetables they had previously purchased, reducing costs and providing something she had not expected: pleasure. Growing food you would eat had a different quality from growing crops you would sell. Both were essential. The pleasure of the kitchen garden was something she allowed herself without guilt. They built a connective fence between the two properties that year, a new straight line of fence posts that made the physical connection between their land an actual fact in the landscape. She installed the east corner posts and he installed the west corner posts, and they met in the middle on a warm May afternoon, each with the last post in hand, and looked at each other across 10 feet of not yet fenced space. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. They set the posts. By 1883, James was 3 and Clara was almost 2, and the Sawyer Talbot adjacent properties were, by the general assessment of Raydrock and its surrounding territory, among the better managed operations in the county. This assessment appeared in the actual county agricultural assessment report, which was not literature anyone read for pleasure, but which contained the phrase "well-maintained and productively managed," and she read this phrase in the county report with a satisfaction she shared with Isaac over supper. "Well-maintained," he said. "Productively managed," she said. "We'll have that put on our door," he said. She smiled at him across the supper table, with James attempting to engineer a structural collapse of his vegetable arrangement, and Clara occupied with a wooden horse Isaac had carved during the previous winter, and she thought, "This is the life I refuse to give up. This is the thing that was on the other side of 4 years of solitary survival. This is what the North Field produced." Del Hooper, she heard through the reliable Raydrock channels, had overextended himself in a cattle speculation in 1882 and had been in financial difficulty since. He had not approached her property again, had not made another offer, had reduced his public profile considerably. She did not feel satisfaction at this precisely, but she felt a clearing of something that had sat in the back of her awareness for years. In 1884, when James was 4 and Clara nearly 3, and the Cimarron Territory was in the process of the political reorganization that would eventually make it part of the future state of Oklahoma, they discussed expanding the farmhouse on her property to allow more family space as the children grew. She had kept the farmhouse maintained and had used it through the growing seasons as a working base for the farm operations, and the idea of expanding it felt right. An acknowledgement that both properties were still active, that the Talbot farm and the Sawyer ranch were both going concerns, that neither had absorbed the other. They built the addition in September of 1884, between harvest and the first frost, with help from 2 hired hands from Reed Rock and the general willingness of Isaac to do the work of several men, which she still observed with the same mixture of practical appreciation and something warmer that had been there from the beginning. The addition gave the farmhouse a proper second bedroom and a wider kitchen, and when it was complete she stood in the new kitchen space with the smell of fresh-cut pine all around her, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that has been built with intention and care on a foundation that was already solid. James came into the kitchen behind her, which he did wherever she went, and put his hand in hers with the automatic trust of a 4-year-old. "It smells like wood," he said. "New wood," she said. "It'll smell different when it's old." He considered this. "Like the barn, exactly like the barn," she said. He appeared satisfied by this continuity and wandered back toward wherever Isaac was working, because Isaac was the gravitational center of James's universe in these years, and she watched him go with a fullness in her chest that was love in its most daily and sustainable form. That evening, after the children were asleep and the hired hands had gone, she and Isaac sat on the porch of her farmhouse in the chairs that had been there since before Thomas died, the same chairs where she had told Isaac yes to the dance, yes to the courtship, yes to the marriage, and the Territory night was enormous around them, stars all the way to the horizon, the smell of September and hay and turned earth. "Do you think we'll be here our whole lives?" she asked. He considered this in the way he considered things, genuinely, without deflection. "I think you will," he said. "I think this land is part of you in a way that doesn't end." She thought about this. "And you?" "Wherever you are," he said simply, "is where I want to be." She turned her head to look at him in the dark. He was looking at the sky, this man who had plowed her field before sunrise without announcement or condition, who had brought Belgian draft horses in the pre-dawn cold and turned the ground she needed turned, and then come back in the morning sun to check the furrows, who had offered her the help that cost her nothing and was worth everything, who had counted 9 days, who had kissed her forehead when the debt was paid, who had carved a wooden horse in winter for a daughter not yet born. "Isaac," she said. He said, still looking at the stars. "I need to tell you something I don't think I've said as clearly as I should have." He turned to look at her, attentive, the way he always was when she told him something real. "That morning," she said, "the morning you had already plowed the field when I came outside before sunrise, I didn't know what to do with it. It frightened me how much it meant." "I know," he said. "I was afraid of being seen," she said. "That someone could see how much I needed something." "I know," he said again, gently. "You didn't make it a transaction," she said. "You didn't make me owe you anything. You just did the thing that needed doing and then came back in the daylight and had coffee." "The furrows needed checking," he said, and she heard the warmth in it. "You could have told me you were coming the previous night," she said. "You could have come at a reasonable hour. You chose before sunrise. The soil is better when it's cool," he said. "Isaac," he looked at her. "I wanted you to have a morning where the worst thing you were dreading was already done," he said. "I wanted to give you that one morning, that was all." She looked at him in the darkness with the stars over both of them and the children asleep inside, and the land all around them and the years of it, the fence lines and the coffee and the dance and the kitchen and the debt paid and James and Clara, and all the furrows they had cut together in the intervening time. "It was not all," she said. "It was the beginning of everything." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. They sat that way for a long time, not talking, in the enormous and generous Territory night, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the life she had refused to give up, arrived into its own fullness, and it stretched ahead of them in both directions. the past that had made them and the future that was still, in all its abundance, being made. The north field behind the house rested in the dark the way good land rests between seasons, not finished, not depleted, but gathering itself for what came next. Patient and alive and fundamentally undefeated, exactly like the woman who had refused to sell it, exactly like the man who had understood before she could say it what it needed, exactly like the thing between them that had started at a creek bank and a coffee cup, and a morning she had walked outside before sunrise to find that she was not, after all, alone. Spring would come. It always came. The furrows would be cut again together, in the good morning light of another April in the Cimarron Territory, with James at the fence rail watching everything that moved and Clara in her arms and Isaac beside her at the edge of the field that had started everything, the field that had required saving and had been saved, the field that in its dark turned rose at dawn had been the unexpected and entirely unasked for beginning of all of this. And she would stand there at the field's edge with the smell of fresh earth around her and her family beside her, and she would feel it, the thing that had cracked the armor and grown through the crack, the forbidden vulnerability that had turned out not to be weakness at all, but the most courageous thing she had ever allowed, the love that had arrived before sunrise without announcement and had simply stayed, season after season after season, as solid and essential and alive as the good Cimarron soil under her feet.